This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the famous, what can I say, intellectual star of this part of the world, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Well, thank you. Intellectual star, it's quite dramatic.
You know, I just keep, I have this sense of disappointment that the last electoral contest did not find you in the White House. And a question I asked to start our conversation is there any way you could get there? If President Trump was impeached, is there some way you could be appointed to something, or could you go in as vice president? What tricky way could you go in there? You know any tricky way to get in?
Yeah, I think the best way I could get to the White House is to try to go over the fence. Now, I
don't
right. promise I will stay there for long.
I was expecting some erudite dissertation as to how a private citizen could wind up there. But okay, we'll let that go and talk about another issue of consequence, which are taxes. Now, taxes, death and taxes. Taxes are necessary. Maybe we could start out by just how the country has handled its tax arrangements over the years. Now, the Boston Tea Party occurred. People tossed in the tea into the Boston Harbor, not wanting to pay taxes to the Crown. Maybe you could start with discussing that. I mean, what about the ability of the British Empire to extract taxes from the colonies, and that in some ways provoked the Revolutionary War? Do you have thoughts about that?
It did. I think the first place to start, and you were talking about death and taxes, a quotation from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. that taxes are the price we pay for civilized society. So I suppose we're extremely civilized at this point with our tax rates. There are probably two reasons to tax, at least in the Anglo-American scheme of things. One is to raise revenue, operating expenses, to be able to build bridges, pave roads, offer public services, that sort of thing. And the other reason to tax would be to influence behavior, to regulate various aspects of the economy, to regulate various businesses, that sort of thing. The British Empire had been taxing the colonies from fairly early on, and they had largely been regulatory taxes. They'd been designed to enforce a mercantilist system designed to keep the colonies interested in producing raw materials as opposed to branching out and trying to develop their own industry and develop their own manufacturing capability. But after the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as the rest of the world knows it, when we essentially started a war with the French here in the colonies for control of North America, and called in England for help when we couldn't beat the French ourselves. And England quite generously came to our aid. We were, of course, part of the empire, sent in tens of thousands of British soldiers to help defend us from the French, beat the French, took over most of the continent for England, and then thought that it would be reasonable, since we were the primary beneficiaries of this war here in the colonies, that we should bear some of the tax burden for paying down the war debt. And so for the first time ever, Parliament began imposing a tax to raise revenue directly on the colonists, and was pretty strict about enforcing that tax. And even though in light of that, our tax burden was still considerably lower than those of people in England, we thought that this was entirely unfair because we had had no say in the tax directly. And there you have it.
Now, just to go into the whole story of taxes, I mean, in a way, going back even earlier to medieval times, the king supposedly had the keys to the kingdom and trust for God. God gave him the power, and then he sort of had his tenants in chief that controlled everything else. And then the rent, you could say, for the land was sent to the king. The king expended it and put a justice system there, and then allegedly protected the kingdom. But even before the mercantile arrangements that were out there, there's sort of a very basic relatively small amounts of money were extracted for basic purposes, defense and justice system. Then the mercantile arrangements occurred where taxes were put in to protect certain products and certain industries. And in the colonies, the tax burden, as you mentioned, was quite light. The way these taxes were extracted, they were not income taxes. They were just taxes on goods. They were consumption taxes. The sort of tax mechanism that's suggested now as a way to raise money. Well, things rolled along like that, and when the U.S. sort of hatched itself out, what was the tax circumstances for the new nation?
Yes, well, of course, you always have property taxes. You could have local sales taxes, excise taxes. Once the Constitution was put in place at the federal level, you had federal excise taxes being levied on whiskey. Of course, this led to the famous Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, and that was quite an interesting event. It was taxation without representation all over again. But the main source of federal revenue was the tariff for the first 100 years or so. And of course, the tariff is a tax on imported goods. And tariffs can be used either for revenue purposes, which they were certainly being used for during this period, or also for regulatory purposes. And this is what Alexander Hamilton was pushing for very hard from the very beginning of his term as Secretary of State. The idea that we were a minnow in a world full of tigers and sharks, and the sooner that we developed industry here in America, the better. And the way to do that was to adopt the protectionist measures of tariffs to make sure that consumers would buy American and keep the money here to develop our economy.
So in the history of taxes, any time taxes are imposed, somebody is going to object to them and be injured by them and say they'd been treated unfairly.
Yes.
You mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion with George Washington leading the troops in to suppress this conflict. The idea that it's not right for the government to tax whiskey is still strongly imprinted in Appalachia, is it not? And the idea is that if you're, particularly at that time, the ability to vote for rural populations, there was still some substantial property requirements, so that people that lived in rural areas often might not have the vote, and then their livelihood was being artificially constricted, they would think, by this tax arrangement.
Correct.
So that's a bruised constituency that didn't like the way the taxes were put down.
Yes.
And another one would be, as we got into the tariff story, that was a substantial objections to this, particularly in the South and particularly in South Carolina, where the beneficiaries of this would be New England and the North. Their industries would be protected, but the South had relatively few industries, and so they would not get the advantage of the tax arrangement. That's
correct. The South actually got behind tariffs for a while right after the War of 1812, when it looked for a time like industry was going to come to the South as well. But this was right when the Cotton Kingdom was taking off, and cotton was such a lucrative business that any hope of manufacturing quickly died out. And at that point, by the late 1820s, the South started objecting to these protective tariffs because the tariffs were hitting the Southern consumers and shifting the money from their pockets into the pockets of the Northern producers. And once again, there was sort of a taxation without representation element here. The South was starting to lose in terms of proportion its representation in Congress by that point. It was being outvoted. And John C. Calhoun, the famous South Carolinian, said that regulatory taxes were not permitted by the Constitution. This redistribution of wealth was simply an abuse of the tax powers listed in the Constitution. And that, of course, led to the nullification crisis of the early 1830s.
And how was that resolved? I know South Carolina, basically 30 years before the start of the Civil War and before the guns were fired at Charleston, already felt injured by Washington.
Yes.
How did Jackson get that straightened out?
Well, it was one of the sectional compromises that you see stretching from 1787 down to 1877, whenever you would get a serious crisis that often had constitutional implications. It was, you would have a crisis during which someone would say this is not just a political matter, but a matter that goes to the basics of our constitutional system. The usual resolutions was some sort of compromise, often between North and South. The 3/5 slave compromise, for instance, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 about slavery in the federal territories. So you had a compromise tariff passed in 1833 that started out quite high and protective and then gradually decreased over a period of several years.
Now, in the pre-Civil War days, how did the federal government spend its tax money? I think they put in some national roads. They did maybe some harbor construction, but basically it was for defense, and it was and justice, sort of the primitive arrangement that occurred in medieval England or medieval Europe. But what else did they spend their money for? I mean, there wasn't much that came in, basically. They spent little of it on. Any comments what they spent it for?
That's about it. We have to, and this is something that's really alien to Americans today, or any Americans really who are alive of whatever age, that down to the late 1800s, you could be born and grow up and get married, have children, get old and die, and often have practically no or even literally no dealings with the federal government other than perhaps to have your mail delivered. The government just didn't do a lot. So yes, the big harbor fortifications in the wake of the War of 1812, the most famous one of those, of course, would be Fort Sumter, that were constructed to keep out the British or any other aggressors. The national roads and some internal improvements, canals and bridges. The Postal Service, of course, and that really took the lion's share of it. The military was fairly small. The Navy was somewhat bigger. Naval vessels, capital ships, took quite a lot of money, but we didn't have a very big Navy.
So in a way, we're sort of in a real low-tax world, if one could say that.
Yes.
Very low and no income redistribution. Mm-hmm. Now, we spoke some about federal taxes, but what about local taxes? And in Georgia, we'd have to say we were in a low tax state in the antebellum era, and Massachusetts would be a high tax state. But didn't the people in Massachusetts, they collected substantial amounts of tax money, but they spent it for schools? Yes. Wasn't that one of the real shortfalls of the South in many ways? They had yes. low taxes. And they had just a terrible school system.
Yes, there was really no public school system to speak of in the South, at least at the primary and secondary level, and even higher education. You don't have many public universities. Of course, there's the great ongoing battle between North Carolina and Georgia as to which one had the first public university.
And which one did, or dare you say?
Yes, I dare not say. Georgia chartered the University of Georgia first, but the University of North Carolina was the first one actually to go into operation.
Yes.
So that's the way we will leave that one.
We'll let that alone for now, I think, yes.
Yes. So yes, local taxes were somewhat different. And also, once again, prior to the Civil War, Americans tended to feel a lot closer and more connected to their state governments. They had a greater commonality of economic interests. The populations were small enough that you were much more likely to know someone on your essentially your county commission, your alderman, or within your state assembly or your state legislature. When there was tension, the tension was often between East and West. As populations moved west, the representation often lagged behind in the state assembly. And so the Westerners would feel, once again, taxation without representation. One of the better examples of these would have been Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, when the Western farmers felt like they were getting a raw deal from all the Easterners in the Massachusetts General Court, and a rebellion resulted.
Yes, well, I guess sort of just examining the tax story of the country, low taxes up until the time of the Civil War, mostly tariffs, raising money, paucity of internal improvements, some but not many, local states extracting differing amounts of tax money, and one of the problems with the South, it being a low tax state, was very little money was spent on public education. It was a terrible problem as time went by. Well, okay, then we had the Civil War. What happened to the tax arrangements there during the Civil War?
Well, of course, wartime always means higher taxes of necessity. And you really got the first federal income tax in American history briefly during the Civil War, in the North, of course. And that did not outlast the war, but you have to pay for the war somehow. And perhaps that got people thinking that we do have this, this new potential revenue stream. And partly as a result of that, within the next 30 years or so, in the early 1890s, you got another income tax passed that was supposed to be a more permanent arrangement.
Well, the war, the government always has problems in wartime raising money, and so varying schemes were adopted. And I think in the South, there was a tremendous amount of inflation, maybe somewhat in the North. The government just printed money, and they sort of, the way the government raised money was by inflating the currency, which actually took everyone's wealth, because if you had your money in a bank, it would just became basically worthless. So the government can extract money from you just by inflating the currency.
Yes, quantitative easing, as we call it these days.
But they also ran the debt up enormously.
Yes.
And the South had, they tried to do that with different ways of bonds backed by cotton, different ways to do that. And basically it was, as is well known, the South had a terrible economic disaster, and the North seemed to come through pretty well, did they not? They were stimulated, and the industries were really had a jump start.
Yes, and they had a better banking system. The national banking system was really was made very robust during the war. You had a lot of capital, of liquid capital, in the northern banks. I believe I'm correct when I say that at the outset of the war, the Rhode Island state banks collectively had more capital available to them than every state bank in the entire Confederacy.
Yes.
And so if you go in with a sounder economy, you've got a tremendous advantage.
Well, now, after the war, the federal government raised money in other ways, and one of them was they had a lot of land. They had homesteading. And they also started to give money to a lot of places they'd never given before, and I think to universities. Was that the Morrill Act? Which act was that? Can you recollect that?
Oh, that sounds right. And the Western Reserve universities. And
right. So the government started to do all kinds of things it had not done before. It subsidized museums. It's still nothing unbelievable.
Yes.
But the taxes were mainly, as I understand it, based on tariffs. It was the major source of revenue, and because the country was growing, there was a lot of money raised that way. And still in the South, there was a very low tax place with not much money going into education. It was just a pittance.
Not much money available.
No,
for anything.
That's right. The economic situation of the South was devastated for many reasons, but it was a very difficult situation.
And even if, once again, you look at the national banking system, and the attempts of the South or of communities within the South to qualify, if you will, for a national bank, they simply did not have the capital available to gain a national charter under the national bank system. You had to have X $1,000s available, and southern communities just couldn't do it.
So actually the capital sort of flowed from the North into the South, and actually some of the money in the North came from Europe. So people, the Rothschilds or big banks were sending money, Bank of England sending money to different places, and railroad bonds were out there. So still, the taxes were light, if one can say it that way, and times went along. And then we had the federal income tax. You want to discuss that, which is a huge deal there.
Yes.
It was the legal ramifications of how that went through.
Yes, by the end of the 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and due largely to the railroads, you see the development of national markets, and you see certain enterprising individuals, Rockefeller, for instance, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Fisk, Gould, managed to tap national markets, proceed with ruthless, cutthroat competition to crush the competition, and to amass fortunes that the likes of which had never been seen in human history. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, shortly after the turn of the 20th century, became the first billionaire with a B. And if you adjust that for inflation to 2017 dollars, Rockefeller could buy and sell Bill Gates almost out of petty cash. That's what $1 billion was worth in 1905, 1910. And so as these vast fortunes began to appear in the late 1800s, and as people became aware of the really terrible factory conditions at that time, the idea of tapping this income stream and redistributing it for the general welfare started to occur to some people, and as a result, other than that temporary income tax war measure of the Civil War, you see the first purported permanent income tax measure passed by Congress around 1894, which the Supreme Court promptly found unconstitutional as an abuse of the general welfare power.
And then it required a congressional amendment, didn't it?
A constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, excuse me, we heard 14th Amendment, the 16th Amendment,
yes,
which was passed and ratified in 1913.
And so the government then had the ability to actually extract income during this period. As we look into the situation, the World War I is on the offing. The other way to extract money is with estate taxes.
Yes.
And I'm not exactly clear when that arose, but the federal government started to extract money from estates. When did that happen?
Well,
Do you know offhand?
You've actually got me on that.
I don't know offhand myself. How is that? Between the two of us, we don't know, Bucky.
Boy,
how is that possible?
I don't know.
We'll get some outraged letters after this.
My guess, and it's purely a guess, would be that it was at roughly the same time as the income tax, or at the latest, probably in the 1930s. It's very redistributionist. It's very presentist. I'm willing to bet that Thomas Jefferson thought about doing it. One of his famous statements was that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living. The idea that the dead hand controlling the distribution of property and wealth from the grave was simply anathema to him, and that wealth is for living generations.
Although he was a beneficiary of the dead hand.
Yeah, he could speak, of course. So. Jefferson was always an elitist, trying to pass himself off as a common man. But so I imagine it would come in no later than the 1930s.
Well, we have the situation where the government is basically gradually increasing its ability to tax, and the money is. In some ways, there's a little bit of redistribution. The redistribution that's taking place in European countries is sort of a model in a way. Particularly the Germans, they're pushing ahead, and then you also had the social tensions that inequality caused in the 1920s, the 1930s, and one can look at the movies of the time and see that there might be I don't know, putting it on at the Ritz. There might be something like that. The rich people in New York, and then there'd be maybe a movie about the poor people, the Okies, the Grapes of Wrath. The sort of social tensions were certainly there, exacerbated by the communist, I guess, experiment
yes.
In the Soviet Union. So okay, we have these issues, and the government, so the government really started to do something, particularly under Franklin Roosevelt, did they not? Their taxes were going up,
yes,
and the money was being redistributed.
Demand-side economics, Keynesian economics, deficit spending, much higher tax rates. And I would incidentally say that, and I'm getting ahead here, but that by the time we got to World War II, the highest income tax brackets topped out at over 90%.
So what I guess I'm getting into is finally, the government has the mechanism to do something. The real thing that increases the government's taxing power is World War II. So every country was desperate to raise money, every mechanism that could be employed to use all of the nation's wealth to defeat the enemy, no matter where it came from, yes. Whatever. And that continued, did it not? Those high marginal tax rates mainly going into defense appropriations. It continued for a long time. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I mean, they dropped considerably after the war, but they still remained higher than they had been going into a Cold War. The economy fairly robust, but the national military establishment, another thing that contemporary Americans don't realize is that prior to World War II, the only time the United States had a large military establishment was during actual wartime. We are a maritime power. Maritime powers do not typically have large standing armies. As my mentor at Duke University liked to remind everyone, that in 1939 the entire United States military establishment could be seated in Yankee Stadium comfortably.
Wow.
But the Cold War made us militarize ourselves in peacetime, and we've never built down from that. And our military budget is just tremendous and has been tremendous for our entire lifetime.
Well, just to jump ahead, as we don't have much time left, we've had a little tour of the tax arrangement. One of the things that's taken place is the government has huge taxing power. It has huge borrowing power. And what's really occurring is redistribution of the nation's resources. So we have the government is the purveyor of money from one group to another, and right now, as my understanding, is a minority of people actually pay income taxes, and indeed many people get just checks from the government. If they're so-called working poor, they get a check from the government. And so the government is in a situation of the whole tax arrangement has changed, and it's to sort of reduce social tension, make the country fairer, whatever that means, and this is what the taxing situation is doing. And now, as we get to the end of our little conversation, the question comes up about what to do about the whole tax arrangements with what's happening, I guess, right now in Congress, as they try and do some reformation of the taxing arrangement. And mostly, as I understand it, trying to do something with repatriation of money from overseas, trying to drop the U.S. tax rate to a lower level, and doing something with marginal tax rates for many people. And as we look at that journey of the tax arrangements, there's a lot of objections now to doing any change of the taxes, because some groups will be infringed upon and others not. Do you have comments about that?
It's such a complicated business, and we haven't had a major tax overhaul since the 1980s. But yes, if I remember correctly, something like 47% of people or families pay a federal income tax at this point. And of course it is redistributive. We pay out something like $1 trillion per year in social welfare redistribution programs. So it's going to be a battleground, and the tax code, whatever it is probably going to be a very complex code. And so the question is going to be, first, what's in the code? Secondly, who are the winners? Who are the losers? It's just hard to tell, and right now it's speculation.
The other point about this is the government is still not raising enough money with our present tax arrangements to pay for their running the government. So huge amounts of money are being borrowed. I think we've talked about that before.
Indeed.
But a real problem is the government's expenditures are so extraordinary, along with income redistribution, which a lot of it is referable to maintaining the healthcare system, which is an extraordinarily expensive thing to do. So we have sort of a conundrum about what the right and fair thing to do is in the country in regards to its tax system. Well, I'll sort of conclude by saying no one likes to pay taxes, but taxes do a lot of good, and unfortunately we're going to have to take out our checkbooks.
The price we pay for civilized society.
I think, well, that's true. So thank you for being here tonight,
thank you.
Bucky. Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.